Last night on this show, we called out 21 members of Congress for voting against and trashing the stimulus package, but then taking credit for all of the good that the stimulus has done in their states when they're back home. The basic idea was that these guys really aren't embarrassed at all about that blatant hypocrisy. In a few cases, they are so unembarrassed that they're willing to be photographed handing out big, goofy, fake stimulus checks, even after they voted against the money that those checks represent. Even as they acknowledge to their constituents that the stimulus works and it's good policy, they'll still denounce it and vote against it because, you know, policy schmolicy, they don't really care about policy. Well, today we heard from one of the Republican politicians that we called out, Republican Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma. His office was upset with our coverage last night, and I will tell you, we do have a correction to make. Senator Jim Inhofe of denying global warming fame, he trashed the stimulus, voted no, then praised its effect in his home state by saying it would help spur additional economic growth. That quote that I read from Senator Inhofe last night, help spur additional economic growth, was in fact Senator Inhofe praising a federal spending project in his state. It was not, however, Mr. Inhofe specifically praising stimulus spending in his state. Senator Inhofe's office is right about that specific quote, and I am happy to correct the record, and I regret the error. I should also note that I could have just picked a different hypocritical quote from Senator Inhofe to make the same point, so I'll just do that now. In April of last year, the Environmental Protection Agency committed $25 million to a cleanup effort in Oklahoma. As the Tulsa World pointed out at the time, quote, the new money comes from stimulus spending as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And, wait for it, Senator Inhofe told the Tulsa World that the cleanup effort, that partially stimulus-funded cleanup effort in his home state, was, quote, great news, and that they were, quote, necessary funds. So there's the senator in black and white praising the use of stimulus funds in his own state. Of course, it almost goes without saying that Senator Inhofe has made quite a show of denouncing the stimulus as a complete waste, telling CNSnews.com, quote, I don't think it failed, I know it. There's no stimulus in the stimulus bill. It was nothing but social engineering and welfare. When asked about the idea of a second stimulus, Senator Inhofe said, quote, why put more money into something that doesn't work? That was 3 months after Mr. Inhofe applauded $25 million of stimulus spending in his state as, quote, great news. The Oklahoma Department of Transportation tells us tonight that the stimulus money that Senator Inhofe says doesn't work has in fact created more than 21,000 transportation jobs in Mr. Inhofe's state. It has pumped $240 million into Oklahoma's economy. Maybe Senator Inhofe just hasn't heard that. Maybe he's not in touch with his own state's government that's keeping track of this stuff. Actually, he doesn't even have that excuse. In March, Senator Inhofe voted against an omnibus spending bill in the Senate. He put out a press release at the time explaining that his no vote on that bill was in part due to his great concern that the bill would endanger those precious, valuable, useful stimulus funds for Oklahoma, the ones he talks so much smack about. He said, quote, if this provision is allowed to stand, it will likely endanger the delivery of the majority of the construction projects funded by the recent stimulus bill. Senator Inhofe, you may not want to be on the list of Republicans who were against stimulus funds in Washington, but for them at home. You may not want to be one of those against it before I was for it hypocrites. You may not want to be on the list of politicians who care so little about policy and what's right for the country that purely for the sake of politics you will shout down and vote no and hurl epithets at something that you know is working. You may not want to be on that list, Senator, but there you are. And thanks for watching the show. Joining us now is Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation. Chris, thanks very much for joining us. Did you have to ski to the studio?
No, I was charioted here, and I was gratified to see you play some clips from my pickup basketball game last night. That was very kind of you.
I'm here to help. Yeah, I would draft you in at least the third round. Chris, even after all of what we just described about Senator Inhofe's record, I think that Senator Inhofe is not embarrassed about this. They just don't care about being exposed for stuff like this. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, they don't care at all. I mean, the key point here is they don't care about policy, and they particularly don't care about policy as long as they're allowed to free ride. I mean, this is the crucial thing. What happened is there's this intense contradiction at the core of the Republican Party, which is that they're constantly bashing government, and when they run government, government grows. It grew 33% in the first term of Bush. It was the largest expansion of government since LBJ, and the way they grow government is really pernicious, a lot of it towards the military, a lot of it to reward their corporate donors. But when they're actually running the machinery of state, they don't deliver. Now, when they're governing, the hypocrisy is so apparent, no one can ignore it, and they got booted out. When they're in the minority party, they're allowed to try to play it, they're able to try to play it both ways, which is essentially to free ride on the votes of the Democrats who passed the stimulus bill, which is absolutely necessary and working, and then criticize it at the same time. It's almost kind of a perfect deal as long as they can try to get away with it.
Well, Talking Points Memo is reporting today that the Democratic Party is going to try to increase the cost of the hypocrisy. They're going to try to make Republicans embarrassed about this. They're going to focus on it from now and up until the anniversary of the stimulus bill next week. What do you make of that as a strategy by the Democrats?
I think it's incredibly smart strategy for two reasons. One is you have to highlight this, and you have to make them look like hypocrites. You have to hammer it home to people that they're lying to you. When they tell you, when they come to your district and they rail against the stimulus, they are lying. They know it works. But the more important point, actually, is that it's able, under this kind of political rubric, to smuggle in an incredibly important substantive point, which is that the stimulus is working. It wasn't large enough by any means, and we know that. But there's just no way to look at the macroeconomic data and conclude anything other than it has helped. It has lowered the unemployment rate. It has increased GDP growth. And by showing that they themselves are doling out the checks, it shows that they tacitly acknowledge that. There's absolute consensus about the fact it's working. If it weren't working, if they didn't think that money was going to work, then why would they be giving out? So I think it's actually really important from the standpoint of defending this crucial policy.
It seems like to me that there are really three tests for whether or not a political offense strategy is a good one. One is whether or not you nail your opponent for something that they really have done. You're being truthful and honest and authentic about the facts of it. Two is that it splits them from their base. In this case, it absolutely does that, the way they've demonized Democratic, that sort of spending. But also that it gets across a core message about what's the difference between the parties and what you stand for while you're still hitting that guy. And that's a perfect storm political strategy to me, and I feel like it hits all three.
Yeah, and the thing, I mean, the example with Inhofe is perfect, right? This is the kind of thing we want government doing. And I don't just mean we liberals or we on the people on the left. I mean, cleaning up Superfund sites, which are massively polluted areas, right? And subsidizing people being able to move out of those areas is the kind of thing we want government to do. And so one of the contradictions you always see is that, sure, people will go along if you call them up in a poll and you bash government, they don't like the spending, they don't like the deficits, but in their lives, operationally, they do like it. And it's really important for Democrats not to forget that. Sometimes they do, which is that if you deliver the goods, if you use the government to make people's lives better, if you move them out of huge polluted areas, they will reward you.
And you should therefore take credit for it.
Exactly. And you should defend the policy and not be scared.
Yeah. Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.
I should also note that Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill sent a letter to state legislators in Missouri today on this very subject, saying, listen, you guys are using stimulus funds in Missouri while trashing the stimulus funds at the same time. Senator McCaskill's letter essentially told the state legislators to send the money back if they hate it so much, and then tell her how they're going to balance their budget. Wow. Okay, so it turns out it will take more than facts to stop Newt Gingrich from attacking President Obama on terrorism. We will peruse Mr. Gingrich's contract with Bullpucky next.